Welcome back to the deep dive. If you've ever just, stopped to wonder how we do what we do, how we see, plan, speak, philosophize, then you've really hit on the central mystery of neuroscience.
You really have.
How does this 3-pound mass of what are essentially simple uniform cells, the brain, produce the staggering complexity we call human intelligence?
It's the ultimate riddle. And for decades, the field of neuroscience was, well, to quote Francis Crick back in 1979, it was stuck.
Right, Crick, one of the co-discoverers of DNA's structure.
Exactly. He lamented that scientists had collected this enormous mountain of facts, just tons of detailed observations about the brain. But he said what was conspicuously lacking is a broad framework of ideas to unify it all, to explain the function.
That's the perfect historical context for what we're doing today, because in this deep dive, we are exploring a theory that proposes to be exactly that missing framework.
Jeff Hawkins' radical rethinking of the brain from his book, 1,000 Brains.
And our focus is specifically the neocortex, that large, wrinkled outer layer that makes up about, 70% of the human brain.
That's right. And it's responsible for everything we generally consider intelligent. Vision, language, music, science.
So our mission today is to really unpack Hawkins's core contention, which is that the brain builds intelligence not through some traditional computing hierarchy where data flows up, gets processed, and an answer flows down.
No, not at all. Instead, he argues the neocortex operates through thousands of parallel, independent, predictive, map-like models of the world.
And that framework, it forces us to redefine what intelligence even is. It's not just having a massive database of facts.
Right. True intelligence in this model is about having a model, a structured internal representation that actually reflects the geometry and the relationships of the world out there.
So knowing what a bicycle is isn't just a list of facts. 2 wheels, handlebars, pedals.
Exactly. It's having an internal structural model that organizes the location of the parts relative to each other, how they move together, and, critically, what predictions you can make when you interact with it. That predictive structural model is what the neocortex is designed to build.
Okay, so let's start with the architecture itself. The foundation of this theory rests on a really major historical insight into how the brain is physically constructed.
Vernon Mountcastle's revolutionary proposal from the 1970s.
Walk us through that. What was Mountcastle's big idea?
It was profoundly simplifying. I mean, when you look at the human neocortex, its sheer size suggests massive specialization, right? You'd think there are different parts for vision, hearing, language, math.
Sure, that's the classic view.
But Mountcastle proposed that the neocortex didn't grow so large by inventing hundreds of entirely new, different circuits. Instead, it grew by copying a single, basic, 6-layered circuit over and over and over again.
And that basic circuit is the cortical column.
The cortical column. It's an economy of design. If you slice a piece of neocortex vertically, you see the same basic 6 layers arranged sort of like a tiny piece of vertical spaghetti. And it doesn't matter whether that piece is processing vision in the back of your head or generating speech in the front.
The structure is the same.
The structure is fundamentally the same. We're talking about a massive scale here. The human neocortex is estimated to have about 150,000 of these cortical columns.
So Mountcastle's implication was breathtaking. It's basically saying this is the brain's operating system.
Precisely. If you want to understand intelligence, you don't need to understand 150,000 different specialized programs. You just need to understand the single universal algorithm that's running inside every single one of those cortical columns.
I see the parallel now. This is a bit like Darwin proposing natural selection as one core algorithm that explains the entire diversity of life, from bacteria to blue whales.
That's a great analogy. Mountcastle was proposing one core algorithm, the cortical circuit, that explains the diversity of intelligence, from recognizing a face to solving differential equations.
But for decades, the question remained, what is that algorithm? What is the core universal computation that every one of those 150,000 columns is performing?
And that's where Hawkins' journey leads, to the conclusion that the fundamental operation is prediction.
And this realization, it didn't come from some complex experiment, but from, seemingly mundane, everyday observations, like noticing a stapler on a desk.
Yes, that anecdote is so revealing. The observation was simply this. If you're working at your desk, you are not consciously thinking about the length of your stapler or the exact position of your cursor on the screen.
Of course not. You're focused on your work.
And yet, if either of those things were to instantaneously change, if the stapler magically shrank or the cursor started moving erratically, you would notice it immediately. Your attention would just snap to the error.
That's a striking insight. Because it suggests the brain isn't just passively waiting for sensory data to come in.
Exactly. It means the neocortex is constantly generating, simultaneously, thousands and thousands of predictions about what should happen next. It's predicting the resistance when you press the coffee cup handle, the exact texture of the wood grain on your desk, the weight of your phone when you pick it up.
It's a relentless, ceaseless prediction engine.
It's an intrinsic property of the entire neocortex. It is not something the brain does occasionally. It is what the brain is. And we aren't aware of the overwhelming majority of these correct predictions. They just run silently in the background.
So just to clarify this for you listening, the failure of a prediction is literally the mechanism that generates our attention.
That's it. Only when reality deviates from the model, when the prediction fails, what we can call a misprediction, does the resulting error signal propagate widely enough to draw our conscious attention and trigger the process of updating that internal model.
The neocortex is a giant, dynamic machine constantly generating, testing, and confirming expectations about the world.
So if the brain is a prediction machine, the next obvious question is, how? What mechanism allows the brain to generate such accurate predictions?
And prediction requires knowing location. This takes us to the truly unique heart of the 1,000 brains theory. Reference frames.
Right. The breakthrough here came, again, from a very simple action back in 2016. Hawkins describes holding a coffee cup. If you reach out and move your finger toward that cup to predict the next sensation, the feel of the ceramic lip, the brain cannot just rely on where your finger is relative to the room or your body.
No, that's too broad.
It has to know your finger's precise location relative to the cup itself.
So the geometry of the cup itself is what defines the prediction. This implies the brain doesn't just recognize a cup by its color or shape, it creates an internal map of the cup's structure.
And that's where reference frames, or RFs, come in. You can think of RFs as invisible, three-dimensional coordinate systems like conceptual latitude and longitude lines that the brain attaches to objects.
Okay, so it's a grid overlaid onto an object.
Exactly. And crucially, these maps are object-centered. If you pick up that office chair and spin it, the RF spins with the chair. If you flip it over, the RF flips. The locations within that frame remain fixed relative to the object itself, not to the room.
And this is where the computational effort of the neocortex lies. Hawkins proposes that the vast majority of its complex circuitry is dedicated precisely to creating, maintaining, and tracking locations within these RFs, not just passively identifying features like red or round.
That is a massive paradigm shift. It shifts the entire focus from feature processing, say, identifying the cup's handle, shape to structural mapping, identifying where the handle is located within the cup's reference frame.
And we should probably distinguish here, there are different kinds of these reference frames, right?
Yes, that's a key point. There are the object-centered RFs, which are essential for that local perception and manipulation, like feeling the cup. But there are also larger environment-centered RFs, which are essential for large-scale navigation and understanding how different objects relate to each other in a room, for example.
This focus on location, it seems to elegantly solve one of the oldest and most perplexing problems in neuroscience. The binding problem.
It really does.
The mystery of if the brain receives thousands of identical electrical spikes from the eyes, ears, and skin, how do we experience objects as unified entities existing outside of us, rather than just a disorganized mess of sensations inside our head?
The solution is that we perceive locations in the world. The brain doesn't just receive visual input, it registers visual input at a specific location within an object's RF. The reason we feel the cup is out there is because the brain has neurons representing the location of the cup in its environment, and then other neurons representing the location of the handle within the cup's own structural map.
Okay, let's get a bit more granular about the architecture here. If we have 150,000 cortical columns, and they all run the same algorithm, how do they cooperate to form a single coherent picture? This is the 1,000 brains part of the theory.
The key is distribution and complementarity. Knowledge of any object, say your smartphone, isn't stored in one single location. It's distributed across thousands of cortical columns simultaneously.
And each column is getting input from a different sensory modality: vision, touch, sound.
Precisely. So a tactile column that gets input from your fingertip might learn the texture of the screen and the exact location of the volume button, all mapped onto the phone's reference frame.
Meanwhile, a visual column, getting input from your retina, learns the color of the phone case and the location of the icons, and it maps those onto that same reference frame.
They are complementary, not redundant. Each column builds its own specialized partial model of the object's structure.
So it's not like they're all just copies of each other.
Not at all. Think of it like a decentralized city water department. One team knows about the pipes in the north, another team knows about the pumps in the south, and a third knows the meter readings. They all contribute to the overall knowledge of the city's water system, but no single team knows everything.
And that provides robustness. If one team fails, the system doesn't just collapse.
Exactly. The other teams can still vote on the overall state of the system.
That's a great analogy. But if you have thousands of columns running thousands of partially correct models, how do we experience a singular unified perception? How does this democracy in the brain settle on a consensus and solve the binding problem so instantly?
This is where the long-distance connections, the axons, come in. Columns are interconnected across broad areas of the neocortex. These interconnections function as a massive voting system.
So when you look at your cup,
Columns specializing in visual input, tactile input, even memory, all send signals simultaneously proposing an interpretation. This is a coffee cup.
and the consensus emerges quickly because the columns that are receiving the most accurate, mutually consistent predictions, for instance, the visual input confirms the tactile input, will overpower any columns that are receiving conflicting data.
You've got it. What we consciously perceive is the stable activity of the voting neurons that have achieved this consensus. The process is so fast and efficient that we are completely unaware of the rapid, chaotic underlying activity of the individual columns testing their hypotheses.
We only perceive the stable, unified outcome of the collective vote, the single located coffee cup.
And the speed of this process is phenomenal. Our perception isn't delayed by calculation time because the voting is massively parallel and continuous. It's happening all the time.
So this stable, unified perception allows us to interact with the world, and that interaction movement is the engine of learning itself. Let's dive a little deeper into the relationship between prediction and this sensory-motor integration.
The mechanism is just relentlessly simple and powerful. The accuracy of the prediction determines the stability of the model. So when a prediction is verified, you reach for the cup, and you feel exactly the texture and shape you expected. The synapses responsible for that prediction are strengthened. The model is confirmed.
But the reverse is where the real learning happens. When a prediction fails, a misprediction.
That's the key. That error signal triggers the immediate reorganization and updating of the model. That error signal is the biological equivalent of telling the system, your map is wrong. Update your geometry now.
And this explains why learning is so fundamentally different from, say, uploading a file to a computer. The brain can't just passively absorb information.
No, absolutely not. To learn the structure of a new object or a new environment, you must move.
Give us the house analogy for this. If I want to learn a new house, I can't just sit in one spot and absorb all the data.
Right. If you just sit in one room, your brain only has a partial view. To build a robust model of the whole house, you have to walk from room to room. You open doors, you turn your head, you feel the doorknob, you gauge the distances between things.
Movement reveals the structure.
Movement reveals the structure. The succession of sensory inputs you receive as you move, the sound of the floorboards, the sight of the next doorway, that generates the predictive data stream necessary for the cortical columns to build and populate their reference frames of the house. Movement is how you actively measure and map the structure of the world.
This focus on structural mapping and prediction, it also gives us a really elegant explanation for why we aren't constantly overwhelmed by the sheer volume of predictions happening. If 150,000 columns are running prediction tests constantly, why aren't we just, hallucinating reality all the time?
This takes us right inside the neuron itself, to the critical role of what are called dendrite spikes. Most neurons are known for their output line, the axon, which sends electrical signals to other neurons. But they also receive input through dendrites, these complex, tree-like branches.
Okay, so if a prediction is running, it doesn't need to fire the full axon signal, which would be transmitted widely and register consciously.
Precisely. Predictions are often stored and expressed as brief, localized voltage changes within the dendrite spikes. These localized spikes temporarily change the voltage of the receiving neuron, essentially priming it.
Priming it for what?
Priming it so that if the expected sensory input arrives, the neuron fires slightly sooner and with more reliability.
That makes perfect sense. They are silent, low-level internal adjustments They change the neuron's readiness to fire, but they aren't sent along the axon to other columns.
Correct. And this allows the neocortex to run a vast number of predictive tests constantly and locally without overwhelming our global consciousness. You are only drawn to the prediction when it fails, and that failure triggers the full axon firing and the consequent error signal that gets your attention.
So to complete this sensory motor loop, the brain also needs more than just location within the environment's RF. It needs to know directional context, right? It needs to know which way it's facing.
Yes, absolutely. If you're standing in a large environment, say a city square, knowing your location is only half the battle for prediction. You need to know which way you are facing to predict what sensory input will arrive next when you take a step.
This is where we bring in those beautiful discoveries about navigation neurons, specifically head direction cells.
Head direction cells, which were first discovered in the older brain structures, are effectively the brain's internal compass. They fire only when your head is pointed in a specific direction, regardless of your physical location.
So they provide the orientation.
They provide the necessary orientation context that ties into the spatial mapping system created by other neurons, like grid cells. Grid cells in the same regions create a remarkably precise, repeating hexagonal lattice map of the environment.
So the columns in the neocortex, when they're learning, are constantly coordinating all this information. Where am I based on the grid cells? What is my orientation from the head direction cells? And where is this object located relative to me using egocentric RS?
Yes, that triangulation allows the column to generate predictions that are structurally accurate. It truly is a geometric operating system for the mind.
We've established that the neocortex is a genius at using these reference frames to model physical objects and spaces, cups, desks, houses. But the staggering leap in Hawkins' theory is the proposal that this identical map-making architecture is applied to everything we know.
Yes, including abstract concepts like democracy, physics, or the relationship between numbers.
This is the moment where the theory really transitions from neuroscience to, well, philosophy.
It does. The premise is that the cortical column is a universal structural modeling machine. It really doesn't care if its input spikes come from the retina, representing visual features, or from the language centers, representing symbolic features.
It just blindly tries to model the structure underlying whatever is causing the change in its inputs.
Exactly. If the inputs change in an orderly structural way, if there are predictable relationships between the elements, the column creates a reference frame for it.
Okay, so when we think of physical space, the relationships are 3D height, width, depth.
Right. But when we think of abstract concepts, the relationships are often higher dimensional, based on conceptual parameters, not physical ones.
So a conceptual space for something like democracy might not have physical dimensions, but it could have conceptual axes.
Yeah.
For example, the x-axis is the level of economic equality, the y-axis is the degree of political freedom, and the z-axis is the rate of legislative change.
That's the core belief. When we talk about democracy, we are navigating a location within that kind of conceptual space. Knowledge isn't stored as a list of independent facts. It's organized by its location relative to these conceptual reference frames.
So becoming an expert in a field, say biology, isn't just knowing the names of a lot of species.
No, it's about organizing them within the reference frame of the tree of life, or within the dimensional space of cellular function, the relationships, the structure.
This structure leads directly to a pretty astonishing conclusion. That thinking itself is fundamentally analogous to physical movement. It's a kind of conceptual navigation.
If all knowledge is mapped to locations, then solving a problem, or planning, or just having a coherent sequence of thoughts involves activating successive locations within the relevant conceptual reference frame.
The progression of your thoughts literally mirrors the succession of sensations you would experience walking through a physical space.
It does, and this is beautifully illustrated by that ancient memory technique, the method of loci, or the memory palace.
Right, where you assign abstract, non-spatial facts, say, a list of historical dates, to specific physical locations in a deeply familiar mental map, like your childhood home.
The fact that this method is so powerfully effective suggests that the brain is hardwired to use its spatial processing architecture, the RFS, for all types of information storage and retrieval.
So retrieval is achieved not by searching a list, but by mentally moving through the familiar house, allowing the locations to trigger the associated facts.
That's it. It suggests we achieve goals, both conceptual and physical, by planning a path through a reference frame. A structural map allows us to anticipate the steps needed to get from A to B.
A roadmap tells you how to get from one point to another in a city.
And a conceptual map allows you to figure out the sequential steps needed to solve a complex engineering problem, where moving from one conceptual location, like the set of assumptions, to the next, a solution step, is analogous to moving your hand across a desk.
So how does language, which seems so specialized and symbolic, fit into this universal architecture?
Language relies on this same architecture because language is deeply hierarchical and nested.
Sentences are composed of phrases, phrases of words, words of phones.
And this structure perfectly mirrors the nested reference frames we discussed earlier.
Okay, I see.
The cortical columns model complex concepts or objects by populating their primary reference frames with links to other reference frames. For example, the conceptual model of a specific species, like a golden retriever, is located within the RF of the broader genus, dogs, which is itself located within the RF of the class mammals, and so on up the chain.
So this is the reference frames all the way down principle. The architecture that models the physical features of a cup within the RF of a room is the same architecture that models a noun phrase within the RF of a complete sentence.
Yes. The structural consistency suggests that language is an extension of the brain's map-making capacity, not some separate specialized module that was invented solely for communication.
Okay, so this structural understanding of the neocortex it has massive implications for how we judge and build artificial intelligence.
It really does.
If the brain is fundamentally a structural prediction machine built on reference frames, it really highlights the immense functional deficit in today's most powerful AI, which relies on deep learning.
Yes, the source material is quite emphatic on this point. It warns that the current wave of deep learning success, this AI summer, could be setting the stage for yet another AI winter.
Why?
Because these systems lack the brain's fundamental architectural principles.
We've seen this kind of failure before, haven't we? Decades ago, with early attempts at symbolic AI, what was called the knowledge representation problem.
That's right. Early AI researchers tried to define common sense using just endless lists of rules and features. A ball is round, usually red, and it rolls. They realized they could never achieve true understanding because they lacked a cohesive structural framework to organize that knowledge.
And modern deep learning is incredibly powerful because it finds statistical correlations in massive data sets. But at the end of the day, it still treats perception as static, like a series of photographs.
Right, it creates a hierarchy of feature detectors. The lower layers detect lines, the higher layers detect eyes, and the very top layer assigns a label. This is a cat.
The massive critique, then, is that deep learning systems, specifically things like convolutional neural networks or CNNs, treat objects as collections of static features, not as dynamic 3D structural models.
They have no inherent equivalent to reference frames or location or 3D geometry.
Which explains things like adversarial attacks, where changing a few pixels that we can't even see can make an AI confidently misidentify a stop sign as a toaster.
Exactly. The AI doesn't understand the fundamental structure of the sign or its location in 3D space. It only understands the correlation patterns it was trained on.
This lack of spatial understanding is why a current AI can't transfer knowledge seamlessly. If you train an AI to recognize an object from the front, it can't easily recognize it from the back unless you've shown it thousands of training examples of the back.
It lacks what's called spatial invariance that's based on structural models.
So if we want to move toward true artificial general intelligence, AGI, Hawkins argues the machine must adopt the architecture of the neocortex. He proposes 4 necessary attributes that current AI lacks.
First is continuous learning. True intelligence updates its model of the world in real time, constantly integrating new data without corrupting old knowledge.
Which current AI systems are terrible at. If you feed them new data, they often forget what they learned previously, a problem called catastrophic forgetting, which requires massive, expensive retraining.
Second, learning via movement. True intelligence relies on sensory-motor interaction to reveal structure. Machines need to actively explore the world, generating a predictive data stream, just like a child exploring a new toy.
Third is many models.
Right. Knowledge must be distributed, complementary, and constantly voting, like our water department analogy. This provides a robustness and a contextual depth that single, massive neural networks just lack.
And fourth, the non-negotiable requirement, using reference frames. Without RFs, a machine can't truly learn the 3D structure of objects, reason about them spatially, or coherently plan movements or abstract concepts.
It's deeply telling that influential figures within the deep learning community, like Jeffrey Hinton, one of the pioneers of neural networks, are starting to recognize this fundamental flaw.
Hinton himself has become quite critical, hasn't he?
He has, noting that current systems lack any sense of location or structural knowledge. He even proposed a concept called capsules, which were essentially an attempt to inject some sense of spatial awareness and reference frames into the deep learning architecture.
So it's an implicit recognition that the current paradigm is fundamentally incomplete.
It signals an inevitable shift. Hawkins relates this moment to a talk he gave at Intel way back in 1992. He was predicting the future of computing, a shift away from massive desktop PCs toward pocket-sized, battery-powered computers that billions of people would carry.
What happened?
The Intel executives rejected the idea, immediately and emphatically. They were deeply invested in the current paradigm making faster and faster desktop CPUs. The inevitable shift, the future that was blindingly obvious in retrospect, was invisible to them at the time because it threatened their current business model.
And Hawkins argues the structural shift in AI from statistical pattern recognition to map-based structural models is equally obvious today, regardless of industry resistance focus on maximizing current deep learning performance.
So if we accept this blueprint for intelligence, we have to turn it back on ourselves. The theory forces a very harsh look at the fundamental division within the human mind.
What Hawkins labels the old brain versus the new brain.
Right. The old brain, about 30% of our total brain mass, composed of the brainstem, the cerebellum, the amygdala, is primitive. It's focused purely on survival, basic functions, emotions, and the relentless maximization of gene replication. It operates on ancient, immediate drives.
And the new brain, the expansive neocortex, is this recent evolutionary marvel. It's the thoughtful, logical, long-term planner, the structural modeler we've been discussing, built literally on top of the older parts.
Which creates a perpetual internal struggle, a constant negotiation. The old brain screams for immediate gratification. Eat that sugar, fight that perceived threat, mate now.
And the new brain calculates the long-term consequences. No, that's unhealthy. That conflict is strategically disastrous. Wait for a better opportunity.
And this conflict can explain some biological paradoxes, like why pain is so excruciating. Why would natural selection be so aggressive about survival signals?
Good question.
Because if pain were merely a gentle suggestion, a polite flag raised in the neocortex, our superior intelligence might rationally override it for some perceived short-term gain.
I see. If the neocortex could easily dismiss the instinctual survival mandates of the old brain, we would do things that shorten our lives and endanger gene propagation.
Exactly. Natural selection ensured that the old brain's dictates are so overwhelmingly painful or pleasurable that the rational new brain cannot simply ignore them.
And here's where the analysis becomes truly critical. Hawkins argues that the true existential threat to humanity isn't AGI, which would be an intelligence operating without these ancient, selfish, gene-driven imperatives.
The threat is human intelligence itself.
The danger is the pairing of the neocortex's godlike capacity to create globe-altering technology, nuclear power, climate-changing industry, gene editing,
with the old brain's short-sighted, selfish, primitive drives, fighting for territory, aggressive resource consumption, rapid, unplanned population growth. We possess 21st century tools that are controlled by 50,000-year-old instincts.
And this destructive pairing is made even worse by the problem of viral false beliefs. Why do certain false beliefs persist, spread, and drive irrational behavior despite being contradicted by overwhelming evidence?
Hawkins details 3 key conditions that allow these false beliefs to thrive and become potentially catastrophic. First, they have to rely on things you cannot directly experience.
Okay, like what?
You can't personally verify the curvature of the Earth, the full complexity of global climate change, or the precise nature of an afterlife. These concepts require abstract thought and trust in external sources.
Right. Second, maintaining the belief requires the host to ignore contrary evidence. The brain is generally brilliant at updating its structural models when predictions fail, but when it comes to these non-verifiable beliefs, it can create internal rationales, like claiming scientists are corrupt or data is manufactured, to maintain the established belief structure.
And critically, third, they must be viral. A belief system is viral if it prescribes behaviors that ensure its spread to other brains, acting like a cultural meme. If a belief mandates strong in-group loyalty, aggressive recruitment, and complete distrust of outsiders, it will propagate successfully regardless of its actual basis.
So when a viral false belief like one that promotes immediate gratification or aggressive territorial expansion is coupled with the neocortex's ability to manipulate the physical world on a planetary scale.
You get catastrophic risk. Exactly. Beliefs that prioritize the unobservable, like an immediate paradise after death, over the present, physical reality, like climate change mitigation, become deadly when paired with nuclear or industrial technology. The primitive drives, magnified by modern tools, create an engine of self-destruction.
This analysis of systemic risk, it forces us to confront an ultimate philosophical choice, doesn't it?
Should we continue to let our future be driven blindly by genes and natural selection, the old brain's agenda?
Or should we embrace our intelligence and our knowledge, the new brain's unique legacy? Hawkins argues that intelligence and the accumulated knowledge it generates, our structural model of the universe, are the only things truly precious and unique about humanity.
And this knowledge is independent of the survival of our specific biological form.
Yes. And this leads to the profound ethical and scientific goal of what he calls estate planning for humanity. The goal shifts from maximizing gene survival to ensuring that knowledge survives even if our species goes extinct due to its own primitive flaws. Estate planning requires a long-term vision. The beneficiaries aren't future humans, but future intelligent beings.
Whether they re-evolve on Earth in 50 million years or they're extraterrestrials, we have a responsibility to leave behind our understanding of the universe.
And the central challenge there is durability. If we want to send a signal that says, we were once here and this is what we knew, traditional means like radio broadcasts or pulsed lasers are completely inadequate on a cosmic timescale.
Completely. They require massive, continuous power and maintenance, and radio waves just dissipate into background noise over interstellar distances. We need something that is self-sustaining and lasts for millions of years.
This brings us to the ultimate provocative proposal, the cosmic tombstone, a self-sustaining, long-lasting signal detectable from light years away.
The idea is to launch a series of orbiting sun blockers, large reflective structures in stable orbits that would subtly dim the light output of our sun.
But the dimming wouldn't be random.
Not at all. It would be arranged in an undeniably artificial pattern, a repeating sequence, like a massive, slowly pulsing beacon of antilight that cannot possibly be explained by natural planetary or solar phenomena.
The beauty of this is its durability. Once launched and stabilized, the system would persist for millions of years without needing maintenance or power.
And to a distant civilization looking at our star, they would see an unmistakable pattern, a self-sustaining signal proclaiming intelligent life was here.
It's a compelling and perhaps a sobering vision. This shift in focus, from the biological mandate of maximizing gene replication to the rational purpose of preserving and propagating knowledge, it gives humanity a new, noble, and arguably essential direction.
Our true purpose, in this view, is to be the universe's consciousness, the temporary mechanism through which the universe understands itself. And the architecture of the neocortex, with its emphasis on structural modeling and prediction, is the very tool that makes that purpose possible.
We started with Francis Crick's frustration that neuroscience lacked a unifying framework. Hawkins's 1,000 brains theory provides that framework, and it fundamentally alters how we view cognition.
It really does. Intelligence isn't feature detection. It's a parallel predictive system relying on geometry, location, and distributed structural models that are unified through continuous voting.
And the implications are profound. Whether we're talking about building AGI that truly understands 3D structure through reference frames, or recognizing the deep ancient conflict between our rational, map-making intelligence and our short-sighted, gene-driven impulses.
Our long-term destiny really hinges on whether we manage to prioritize our structured knowledge, the legacy of the neocortex, over the primitive mandates of the old brain.
It provides clarity on two fronts. A clear architectural blueprint for what AGI must look like, and a clear warning about the self-inflicted risks posed by our own human nature. The ultimate scientific goal, defined by this structural framework, becomes the continuous, directed acquisition of knowledge and the preservation of that knowledge for the future.
And that pursuit is what validates the massive investment in energy and resources that our brains represent. It is the unique responsibility of human intelligence.
For a quick visual breakdown of Hawkins's core concepts, including reference frames, predictive modeling, and the architecture of the neocortex, see the mini explainer linked in the description for 1,000 Brains.